Hi, welcome to the CIDCI Online Salon Series, and happy Juneteenth to all of the Americans in the audience. I'm Margie O'Driscoll, and on behalf of the CIDCI Board of Directors, I'd like to welcome you here today. CIDCI's mission is to accelerate innovation, disruption, and change to improve the built environment. We create networks that share knowledge, experience, and ideas through productive dialogue. CIDCI is a not-for-profit organization that relies on your financial support to provide these programs. Thank you to our sponsors who make all of this possible. CIDCI is proud to announce the start of our Innovation Lab next month. Led by UC Berkeley's Sarah Beckman and Rachel Zombach, this online program uses a self-paced format to create a community of practice within the AEC community. The 6-module program will teach participants the mindsets and skill sets associated with the innovation process. The content for the modules will all be delivered asynchronously via Google Classroom and will include videos, readings, and discussion questions. Participants will be able to access the material at any time during the 2021 session. Details and applications are available on the CIDCI website. CIDCI is also starting to plan our fall forum, which is entitled Inspiring Innovation in a Re-emerging World, and that will be October 4 to 8. Over 5 days, we'll spend our mornings or evenings, depending upon your time zone, exploring a wide range of issues, including how building owners view our return to work post-pandemic, what failure can teach us about resiliency, and we'll also examine some of the startups changing the world. All of these events will be online. If you see something you want to share with a client or friend, feel free to direct them to the CIDCI website to hear recordings of all of our events. Okay, here's a bit of information about how today's session will work. We're recording this presentation and we'll place it on the CIDCI website as soon as possible. If you have questions or comments during the presentation, please use the chat box. Today's session will run for about 60 minutes. Today, we will explore how a construction robotics company puts robots in the hands of skilled workers to reinvent drywall finishing. Our speaker is Henrik Bennetson, joining us from his home here in the Bay Area, a serial entrepreneur with a passion for building high-performance and empathic teams to accomplish wonderful things. As the co-founder of Canvas, Henrik is charged with setting and executing business strategy. Prior to Canvas, Henrik was the Chief Business Officer at Other Lab. Welcome, Henrik. We're glad to have you.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here. Am I on now?
Are we doing this? You're on your own.
That's scary. I hope you're seeing my slides now.
It's great.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. I am delighted to be here. In the prep for this, we had a chat about this talk, and it was pretty clear that you all did not want sort of the usual sales pitch. So I've resisted the urge to give that. This is more going to be a story of the innovation of Canvas, how we made our way to markets, some of the key things we've learned along the way. And it's the first time I'm giving this talk. I think, in fact, a lot of stuff that I'm going to talk about in this talk, I don't think anybody from Canvas has really talked about in public before. So I've had a little bit of a knot in my stomach, a little bit of nervousness, about little butterflies, I should probably say. But I'm also excited to sort of dig into it. It's certainly something, as a serial entrepreneur myself, I really am very excited to typically learn from people who are willing to share open and honestly about how things came to be. So that has been my aspiration for this talk. So here goes. Basically, there are going to be 4 steps to this talk. First of all, I see some familiar faces in the audience. There are also some folk I don't know. So it's probably okay to just give a little bit of an introduction to what the heck Canvas actually is. And then I'm going to go back to the origin story of Canvas. It's often in these sort of foggy early days that really important, vital decisions are being made. I'm going to talk through some of ours. And then I'm going to move on to the key things that we have learned along the way in Canvas. There are 7 things I highlight, though certainly that's not the full list, but those are some of the key things that I thought maybe other people could uniquely benefit from. And then I've tried to not ramble on for too long, so we actually have time to ask questions at the end. So fingers crossed that I succeed in this. But basically, the introduction to Canvas might be best started off by essentially playing a little video for you that lasts about a minute and shows Canvas in the wild with our good partners at Swinnerton and Brookfield. Check it out. So some of you may recognize the 5M project here in downtown San Francisco. It's a very large building, a very large undertaking with essentially developed by Brookfield, and Swinnerton is a GC, and we worked with them on this project, and it was a very exciting project from us. Canvas team has peaked at about 75 people here. We've had a busy spring. 5M here have been one of the jobs we've been on. We were on 4 concurrent jobs recently, which is something of a record for us. So we're really trying to sort of scale from these early days. We're about 4.5 years into the journey into reinventing drywall. I'm going to show the timeline in a minute. But essentially, Canvas goes to market as a tech-enabled drywall subcontractor. I'm going to dig into why that is our model in a moment. But the key thing that really makes us different is that we're building this very unique tool. So essentially, we're trying to really reinvent drywall finishing. I will also dig into that, but I'd like to say that our level of ambition is equivalent to going from digging a hole with a shovel to using an excavator. Now let's dig a little bit into the origin story of Canvas. It actually starts back in 2012. As a research project, we actually spent a handful of years in research doing work at a place called Other Lab, which is a privately held research lab here in the Mission in San Francisco. We were working with DARPA, NASA, the Navy, Airbus, Toyota over the course of this research path. And the running theme through the work was always that this new type of machine is possible, a machine that can sort of go into the world where there is variability and other things that have made it hard for advanced manufacturing equipment to go so far. So that is basically the course thesis running through the work. But we always wanted to do something. We always wanted to find a big market that we could really sort of put everything behind and then commercialize into. And after a few years of research and a lot of learning, we started to think about commercialization. And what you really want to do in that case, which is sort of interesting, right? Because the whole world is out there and you have this machine that's roughly this generic thing it can do some interesting things, but nothing really well enough at this point in time. Then what you want to do is you want to go look for the dirty, the dull, the dangerous tasks out there. You want to find something that really a machine with its unique affordances can change in a really meaningful way. I call this sort of the latter stage of the research, the 500 conversations phase. It basically was me and a bunch of engineers at this point in time, and I went into the world to try and find what the heck this company was going to be founded around. And I actually had brought a lot of things back to the company, only to have them really shut down. No, this won't work for this technical reason. This won't work for this reason. And sometimes there were business reasons. It was very difficult. At some point in time, construction caught my eye. Now, you need to know about Canvas that really nobody at Canvas's founding stage here had construction background. What caught my eye was these productivity slides that I think everybody in construction is roughly sick of seeing at this point in time. So I'm not going to show you that slide. But basically, the low productivity versus manufacturing really sort of caught our eye. And we actually think that low productivity is roughly not because there's anything wrong with construction. We actually think that construction have been underserved by advanced manufacturing equipment that had benefited manufacturing so much. And we were essentially founded around this idea that these types of machines, these types of tools now were in this profoundly new place where you finally didn't have to bring the task to the machine as something that looks like an assembly line. You can now take a machine into the world where it could perform interesting work. So essentially construction is distributed manufacturing. So it was actually a pretty interesting place for us to go. Now, so what do you do then? I didn't have construction background, as I said, none of us did. So I literally just went to my LinkedIn and I searched construction. And then I just talked to everybody in my network who knew something about construction. The key conversation there was I met one of my connections who actually works in construction. And what was really interesting about it, we actually had beers one night here in Cortland Avenue in Bernal Heights here in San Francisco. And over beers, he gave me this super visual description of how drywall finishing had gone wrong on his construction site that day. And he talked about the volatility, he talked about labor shortages, he talked about a lot of things that were hard about it. And of course, as a startup person looking for a good market, when you hear about this type of pain, then your instincts should pick that up. Now, probably can't go a lot further in this talk without making sure that we're all on the same page about what drywall finishing essentially is. But when you build interior walls, you first frame them, then you hang the drywall. Now you have to finish it. I like to say finishing is the stuff you have to do to wall panels so they're ready to paint on. So essentially you want to make flat, continuous walls. And as I'm hearing this description, I like to think of it as this light bulb moment. And those are kind of rare. We have been doing research for 5 years at this point in time, and the light bulb moments are really far between a few. And you don't always know them except in hindsight that this is actually a light bulb moment. But I was excited enough to go back, and this is like 10 o'clock at night, a few beers in my head. I'm like texting Kevin, my co-founder, and I was like, Kevin, if you're still up, can you give me a call? So he calls me. He's like, "What's up?" I was like, "Drywall finishing takes like 5 to 7 days, and it's this like very stepwise process, and I really think this is something we could improve." And he was like, "Huh, interesting." And then he started doing his research. I started doing my research, and sure enough, drywall finishing actually turned out to be quite an interesting thing. So we essentially had our light bulb moment. And again, what really caught our eyes was essentially the pain, that dirty, the dull, the dangerous, which is really what you should be looking for. So super, super high level drywall finishing essentially at this point in time is roughly a 70-year-old process. Drywall became the predominant paradigm for building interior walls about 70 years ago. And certainly there have been tool upgrades since, but really the process has roughly stayed in that same paradigm, if you will. The work has high volatility, there are massive skilled labor shortages, and also it's work that can really go wrong because of the variability of it. And then also you have real health and safety concerns with this work. People who have been doing this work for years really have often sacrificed their health and their bodies in the service of this work. So there was a real opportunity here. So we believe that we had found the problem that we wanted to solve. Now, the problem is enough. You also need a business model to put around it. And when you looked at this market, it was actually quite a scary market to sell to. There were thousands and thousands of companies doing drywall finishing across the nation. It amounted to a big market, but it was served by a super fragmented set of companies. In the startup world, we sometimes talk about the adoption risk. It's not enough to build that better mousetrap and expect people to be the path to your door. You actually need to get yourself to believe that you can get the market to adopt this innovation as you bring into it. History is littered with examples of superior technologies that never found their markets. So there was a key moment when we thought to ourselves, well, what if we in a go-to-market phase weren't trying to sell the machines? What if we were a company that had a machine that allowed us to do some work better eventually because we had this machine? And this is what we call the tech-enabled Drywall Sub. So that would give you a lot less adoption risk, because essentially we could go to a customer and saying, initially we could say, just give us a couple of walls and we'll make them flat at a competitive price. So no adoption of machines, no, frankly, machines that don't work quite that well at this point. And so you could really minimize this adoption risk by essentially just being a frictionless drop-in replacement for what they already did. Of course, it also leaves you with the problem that now a bunch of people from tech, geeks, now have to learn to essentially run a construction company. And that is essentially the next part of the talk, is that over the course of these 4.5 years, where we've gone to market with this technology inside of this business model, the tech-enabled Drywall Sub, we have learned a few things. And that essentially is the next part of my talk and the meat of it, if you will. What are some of those key learnings that we have had to learn, and frankly had to learn the hard way, that perhaps others could benefit from? One of the key aspects for us really was to validate our approach as fast as we could. Now, remember that we have been doing research for years. And now all of a sudden we had to build this, what people in the startup world typically call a minimum viable product. We had to build a version of this that could actually get us knowledge and confidence that we were on the right track as soon as possible. So we ended up on our first job about 6 months after this light bulb moment. I don't mind telling you that that was a super scary thing for us to do. Reid Hoffman, the founder of LinkedIn, has this quote I really like. He says, if you're not embarrassed about the first version of your product, then you've launched too late. And we were plenty embarrassed and scared, I would say, when we did this first job. So I often laugh about this idea that a more truthful pitch about what we looked like at that time, and actually that picture you can see on the slide here, is what the machine looked like on that first job. What you just saw in the video hopefully looked a little more streamlined than this poor thing. But basically, a more truthful pitch about Canvas at this point in time would probably have been, make drywall worse with a complicated machine. That essentially was, in a nutshell, what we were doing. Thankfully, we found folks who are willing to give us a shot, which is what we really always need. And I kind of couldn't help myself but go back in the folder and check out or pick out a few pictures from the very first job that Canvas ever did. Now, we showed up with this rental truck and a bunch of geeks in inexpensive PPE that we had bought from the Home Depot. You can imagine that sort of the actual construction people there, they were gracious. Let me say that they were gracious enough to keep their thoughts to themselves when we came rolling up in this rental truck. We also had to spray this material, and we used a lot of it. So basically, in the early days, it was essentially somebody's full-time job to, mix this drywall compound, also known as mud, and just pour it in a hopper. So the work didn't scale in any which way back then. There were so many aspects of this that were just crazy and simple, but that is kind of the idea with the minimum viable product. You are allowed to have it to be held together with duct tape and WD-40, but these days it's quite a bit more streamlined. The other thing was like the drying time for this material. When we have sprayed, then we come back, and then we're coming back to sort of sand it, where we essentially change the tool at the end of the robotic arm. Now, when we came back to sand, this thing, the material was still wet. Now, that has never happened to us in our lab before because our lab had pretty good airflow. This construction site had no airflow whatsoever. So the material just roughly would not dry. So we had to wait and come back again. So you can imagine that people who already wondered a little bit about how legit we were, seeing us come back and then have to come home probably wasn't the most awe-inspiring thing that any of them had ever seen. But this was like the team that sort of was there on that first job. And I mean, look at us. We were so happy. We ended up sort of landing on our feet after all these trials and tribulations. But I get really nostalgic looking at that picture. A quick side note is that sort of construction friends later told us that this whole slanted helmet thing that I have got going on, and Maria, my co-founder, who's standing a back row to the right behind me, have got going on, that's just a big no-no in construction. People laugh behind you at your back if you look like someone who's out of a musical on construction or something like that. So there was a lot to learn. So this first job was really humbling, but we really learned a lot along the way. And I would sum it up as the key learning number one, which is you really don't know anything about what you got until you test your product on a real construction site. So that is why this minimum viable product is so important. And frankly, this humbling journey to that first job turned out to be so important. So at this point in time, you can imagine that even we now understood that we needed some actual construction experience. This is a picture of Teresa, who actually had a wonderful journey with our company. And next, we were really bringing in, we were now realizing that we're actually a team of technologists. And it's pretty clear that we need a professional taper on the team. Tapers are the tradespeople who perform this work. And we really instinctively knew that getting that first hire right was so important. By the time that Teresa walked in to interview, this picture is literally from that day she interviewed with us, which was another very fond memory. We had interviewed about a dozen tapers, and we really felt that we were looking for someone who really knew the trade, but was also sufficiently open-minded to be able to really help us develop this machine and accept how bad it would be for a long time until we could finally get it to be good. Now, so we were getting quite desperate because it was very hard to hire for, and we were starting to think, are we looking for some unicorn that actually doesn't exist? Now, in walks Teresa, actually one of the first women to work in the construction trades here in the Bay Area. And we had asked for a taping class as part of her interview, and Teresa just nailed it. She was just, I think in another life, she might have been a teacher. She just walked us through it in this way that was just kind of amazing. And I could not stop smiling because 2 minutes into this, I knew that we had found our person. And she really has helped us so much in make our machine actually useful for the skilled worker running the job, because ultimately we are making a tool for Teresa and the other trade workers doing this job. And without that, her insights, like, this tool would not have worked. She would actually even shine in front of construction executives when we brought them to the office and we explained our process to them. When I explained it to them, they would like to sort of, go into a bit of detail with me. And it was kind of a skeptical audience. But when Teresa explained the process, nobody ever really seemed to mess with her because they just kind of intuitively understood here was someone who really knew what they were talking about, frankly, unlike me. So we had promoted Teresa a couple of times. First, she ran her own crew. Now she's actually a taping superintendent. She's running multiple crews right now. And she's had this fantastic journey with the company. And there have certainly been other key construction people we added along the journey who have just been transformative for us. Another one I can mention is Mike Mayock. He runs Mayock Drywall. In the super early days when we really did not know what we were doing, Mike and Teresa and several others I could mention just have been incredible in help guide us along the path. So that's my key learning number 2. If you are not solving your own problems, then you really need to bring in the professionals. But what about the unions? You can imagine in a movie about construction that the unions, trade unions, and a venture-funded robotic startups, surely these must be each other's arch enemies, right? We were told a lot of scary stuff about unions from investors and others. Looking back, frankly, a lot of this stuff now, I see it for the secondhand knowledge it was, but people were like, unions are going to hate this. You're in for a fight. You better figure this out. I think one of the things that we did right, perhaps in our naivete, was that we actually just picked up the phone and called. So you can look up who your local business agent is. Ours was called Carlos from the Painters and Finishers Union. DC16 is like the regional part of this. Pick up the phone and call Carlos. Now, Carlos, I am a guy in a startup. I'm working on a tool that might impact your industry. Can we talk? And he's like, sure, let's meet up. And I actually met Carlos in a cafe. I'm almost embarrassed to say because I heard so much about these scary union people that if he was some madman, I could not have him at the office. Now, Carlos, of course, was not a madman. He was a very, very reasonable guy who cared about his members and progression in this industry as much as I did. He was also a dad. I remember when you're sitting across from someone, flesh and blood and a human, then it's all those kind of scary things about people just kind of seems to melt away. Unions have actually been amazing for us. Before we had a contractor's license and we needed to go out on jobs, they actually lent us their training facilities out in St. Leandro. And at every term, we've been able to just pick up the phone and call them and see real partnership on the other end. We also do our best to proactively keep them in the loop. We've actually, I was on a call with them the other day where I was telling them about our roadmap, where Canvas was going, if they had any concerns and anything we could collaborate around. So Canvas is execution arm that go out. This tech-enabled Drywall Sub is proud signatory to DC16 Painters and Finishers Union. So my key learning number 3 is do not settle for secondhand impressions. Move in close. Make sure you know what you're talking about because you went and found out yourself. And I think that sort of attitude about how to enter the industry with actually going to have conversation with people is important. Now, you'll often hear startup people and people in the startup ecosystem sort of throw around the word disruption. I myself have been plenty guilty of this. And like a recent example, of course, that shut down tragically was Katera. For me, they also represented this kind of disruption approach, which often feels like kind of a lot of criticism without acknowledging that the industry actually does a lot of things right. For me, disruption is this kind of adversarial act. It's something you go and do to somebody. So my advice, based on what I've learned with Canvas, to startups and other people who tries to bring innovation, show up to have a conversation. Show up to listen with intent to people because startups and construction have so much to learn from each other. I am super grateful for our early collaborators such as Swinnerton, Webcore, DPR. They've just been willing to be patient with us and learn. I also would like to think that maybe a bunch of productivity obsessed geeks such as us also kind of could open a few doors for them. But it's really been a conversation, and I think that has gotten us to where we are today. So my next key learning is basically drop the disruption bullshit, pardon my French. The other thing, and this is something that probably pertains more to robotics and machines, is don't make machines that do what people do. Some of you may have seen this video that came out a few years ago about this like Japanese drywall robot. So this is like essentially it looks like it's like a humanoid robot. It's essentially this anthropomorphic machine. It carried drywall, it sort of put it up against the wall, and then it terrifyingly held a nail gun and was sort of shooting nails in with this thing. Now, it essentially just looks like somebody who tried to do with a robot what a skilled hanger of drywall would do. And of course, in the 3 years or so since I saw the first video, this thing has not been brought to market because honestly, it just will never work. There's plenty of Japanese robotics research for those who care to go look that actually shows you that whenever you try to essentially use the machine to mimic what the person already does, you lose. One of the things that you develop a healthy respect for is the adaptability of the human body as you do this type of work. Instead, what you need to do is you need to look at the task and you look at what you're trying to get done, and then see if you can change this task to what is uniquely possible with a machine. In our case, it meant spray on the drywall. Don't use the trowels, don't use the boxes, don't use all the traditional tools. Find another way to get this compound on and then sand it back afterwards, because the machine has consistency and precision, but it doesn't have the adaptability and all the other good things that the people do. So the current manual way of doing drywall finishing makes absolute sense when you're doing workers and they're skilled, they're artisanal, they can do this work awesomely. Machines could never do that, but machines could do other things, play to the strength of the machines, and then you might have something. There's this one quote I love from this guy, Marshall McLuhan. He says, "We walk backwards into the future." Basically, even as we make progress, we sometimes take a bunch of assumptions with us as we make progress. And I would say that's the next key learning for me is don't walk backwards into the future. Be very careful with the assumptions you make. For instance, like that you need a humanoid robot to do what this thing does. Instead, be very, very careful with your assumptions. And that sort of leads me to my next point, which is a point about Crossroads. Because as you work in a startup or really any innovation context, you'll find yourself at a lot of crossroads. You're constantly asking yourself, when do you really do what the conventional construction industry is currently doing about this? And when do you maybe know what the convention is, but you make this deliberate choice to take a startup innovation path? Now, if I knew how to make these choices right always, I believe I'll be a very happy man. It's a very difficult thing to do. And I think whether or not a company like ours that sort of moves in the realm of both construction and sort of the entrepreneurial ecosystem, on both sides of these equations, like we really find ourselves constantly at this type of crossroads. You know, when I first came out and talked to investors, I have this like very visceral memory of we came out and we said to them, well, we actually don't think there's any other way to get this product to be good enough in the go-to-market phase, but to be a tech-enabled drywall subcontractor as our business model. Now that means we're going to employ people like Teresa who wear boots to work. We're going to have to sit down with unions and come to some form of understanding. I can tell you that I was kind of laughed out of many investor offices for this thing. This is like the dumbest thing they ever heard. This kind of operational overhead and the rest of it. But to this day, I actually don't think that we in our go-to-market phase could have done so many different things. And it's a classic sort of, maybe, I don't know if it's classic, but it's certainly an example of this kind of crossroads you find you're at, where we had to go against conventional startup wisdom and do something that was more learned from construction. And sometimes we also would have to sort of ignore what conventional construction taught us and then take the startup path. And when to do what, that is the question. So that's key learning, I believe, number 6 I'm up to at this point in time. You should expect some crossroads because this is hard stuff. And then this is, I believe, the final key learning. This is the thumbs up you really need. First, let me acknowledge that I'm totally using a stock photo here that still has watermarks on it. I just really like this picture, and as a scrappy startup, I was way too cheap to actually go buy it, so I apologize to the stock photo people here. But over time, we have talked to a lot of execs in construction. I'm sure that there are some on this call as well. We've also talked to a lot of innovation people, and we would often be able to make pretty good progress with them. And we're very grateful for the role that they have played in Canvas's progress. But getting the folks who work in an office to think this is a good idea, it's just not enough. What really matters is what folks in the field thinks. So that is really that thumbs up you really need. Now, construction workers in the field, They will give you some tough love. They will not suffer fools. If this machine is causing problems on their construction site and they are on a tough schedule, you will know about it. You will get some of that tough love. You have to develop thick skin. But again, the key learning is, and number 7, I think, is that until the people in the field want what you're building, it's not real. People in construction that are closest to the problem have to be the one that sign off on it. So all the execs and innovation people in the world can be helpful, but you really, really need to win on that construction site. And that's really something we had to learn the hard way. I think we mistook some of this progress with folks at the office for actual progress, only then to stall out later because our product was out there and just not good enough. So that takes me to the Q&A. And I certainly hope that you all have some questions and are willing to do it. It looks like I left us enough time to do it. So I think I'm going to go ahead and stop my screen share. And maybe we can be more conversational from here on out.
Henrik, that was fantastic. I loved your humility at approaching, some points at which you probably said, "Yeah, that was a mistake. I should have done something different." And I think that is not something we always hear in the venture capital world. So I want to say I think that personally probably has a lot to do with your success. I know you've worked with Todd Mercer at Webcore, and he wasn't able to join us today. I had asked him to, but he sent me a couple of questions. So I'm going to throw out one of his questions to you, which is, what do you think the path to machine adaptation within the entire industry looks like? I mean, you focus on a very discrete problem, but what do you think about it, or have you had a chance to think about it in a holistic way?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And shout out to Todd. I'm kind of smiling at the idea that Todd may be watching this later on his couch with eating some popcorn. There's definitely a moment in time here, I think we're at, where this new machine is possible. There's a very powerful why now moment. We're really standing on the shoulders of a lot of investment into self-driving cars that have driven down the prices. Some of the sensors we use on our machine today that we buy for hundreds of dollars. My co-founder Kevin, who came from Boston Dynamics, he had similar capability on his machines in the early days, where he paid like $1 million for the same ones. We are clearly at this moment in time where this kind of go into the world, understand it well enough to work on it, is possible. So we really do think that in one of the early sort of pitches we had this Venn diagram that sort of shows the world of automation and construction as these kind of two separate bubbles that didn't touch each other. And we think the opportunity was to sort of push these two together and bring incredible productivity to construction via these newly possible advanced manufacturing equipment. So I would say I'm very optimistic about the whole market. I also want to give a shout out to other folks who are sort of doing what we're doing. Like, look at companies like Dusty Robotics. They actually recently announced funding, run by Tessa Lau, who we think the world of. Built Robotics. There are others out there, and there is clearly a broader kind of wave of this happening right now. That's sort of, I would say, maybe the global view. I think you're going to find these advanced machines in construction. For Canvas in particular, I've talked in this talk quite a bit about being a tech-enabled drywall sub in this go-to-market phase. Now that the machines are getting more robust and actually are no longer, doing drywall worse with a complicated machine, now Canvas, we're now finally, I would say, talking to our customers about them running the machines. I see Henning from DPR on this call. We're talking to DPR about running the machines. We're talking to a bunch of customers about it. Basically, what would it look like for you all to take Canvas as machines? Canvas is now no longer this tech-enabled drywall sub that we by necessity had to be. We are now the people making and supporting the machines so that trained construction folks can finally sort of run them in the field. And hopefully together we will then really transform the face of what this work looks like. So that was sort of the macro situation and the Canvas situation in particular. I hope that answers the question.
So Steve Burrows. Steve, I think you're unmuted. Do you want to ask your question?
Sure. Hey, Henrik. Thanks for that presentation. I wanted to ask what you think is next for tech-enabled subs, not just for Canvas, but for tech-enabled subs in general.
It's definitely an interesting question. Thanks, Steve. First of all, I think tech-enabled subs, when it comes to the construction side, I sort of imagine almost that's what you have to be. There are a lot of things about construction that we've all seen, the McKinsey reports and other things where it's like one of the least digitized industries and the rest of it. And then you sort of ask yourself, why haven't digital tools found their way into this industry when they found their way into so many other industries? And when you look at a drywall sub, for instance, and then you look at their profit margins, and then you can sort of now quickly understand why they are not running R&D and other things. So I think most of them won't have an innovation department to essentially help bridge you into the industry. Being a tech-enabled drywall sub allowed us to be this drop-in replacement for what was there. So I think you're going to see more people take that model. And frankly, it's not the typical startup model. Paul Graham of Y Combinator has got this great essay where he talks about a lot of people in the startup world has what he calls schlep blindness, which is like they prefer almost to sit in kind of like some ivory tower and develop technology and let other people use it without really sort of getting out there and getting their hands dirty. Now, I don't know how we could have gotten this machine to where we've gotten it without getting our hands dirty. So I think you're going to see more tech-enabled people in this industry who come out and essentially do these tech-enabled services, whether it's subcontracting services or other services in the industry, because I think it's just the most frictionless way to mitigate the adoption risk of this industry.
Great. We have Henning Rodell. Henning, do you want to ask your question?
Yes. Henrik, great presentation. Really enjoyed it. Had a quick question about this, driving further on the point of at what point do you think the industry will be ready, the construction industry will be ready to start taking on these new robots themselves rather than having startups building up this sort of field subcontracting arm?
Thanks for that question, Henning. And by the way, I loved hearing the family in the background. I think that if one thing Zoom does, it like humanizes us all because we all bring our full loud messes into these calls. Thanks for the question. I really think there is a key role here in again, I talked about wanting that conversation. I think there is a role on either side of the sort of the construction space and the startup space to sort of reach out their hands and grab each other a little bit. I think construction startups need to realize that we really need to make the machines quite good, because in construction there is no real dress rehearsal, if you will. When you're out on the construction site, it's for real. People on a tough schedule and money's at stake. There's very little kind of in the lab practice except what you are able to sort of stand up yourself. So as a startup, we really have to learn to respect that we can't go out and screw up some other schedule because we're testing our machine. So we have essentially come out with enough manual labor to save the day if the technology fell over and died, which I don't mind telling you has happened on some occasions. I think from the industry as well, and actually, I see a lot of this come out of COVID as well. I think in the industry there is a little bit of this. There's pain in the ecosystem right now. Like we're sort of there's this maybe recession thing happening with COVID, though it looks like we might be okay. But there's certainly some change around offices and how the industry can sort of be responsive to what their customers will want in the future. So in the industry, I see more investment into innovation, more I like to say more activity today that is done in the service of how tomorrow might be different. Whereas I think even this like a small handful of years ago when we got started, like those people were far between and few. So on the part of the industry, mean, Henning, I know Henning, and Henning works in innovation for DPR, and he's actually in the role of being this bridge to the industry. And frankly, one of the first things that we had to do as a company was go find the Hennings of this world so that we even had any kind of path into this industry. So I think both industry and startup, there's a role to play to essentially build a bridge to each other, because I really think that I think they need each other. I think for startups, construction is an incredible, mind-blowing opportunity, and I think construction also can move forward through leveraging new technology in ways that I think should grow the pie for everybody and be pretty exciting.
Thanks, that was great. Vivin, I've unmuted you. Do you want to ask your question?
Sure. Henrik, great presentation. It's been great to see you grow over the last few years. One question I have is, what do you see as your biggest challenge in the next 2-3 years?
I think the painfully honest answer is the machines have to be good enough. You know, I like to say that you know, we work at the level of ambition of going from digging a hole with a shovel to using an excavator, because I like this idea that an excavator is this incredibly powerful tool that also doesn't do a lot until skilled people wield this superpower that it gives them. We're not an excavator yet. We're not sort of a no-brainer for this thing to really be good enough. Like, we still have some road to travel with these machines. I'm pretty proud of the progress we made, but it's also pretty clear that by forging this path into this idea of taking machines into the world, we have grappled with a technical problem of a magnitude that, honestly, I think if you had understood sort of the full nature of it when you started, it probably would have seemed daunting. So we didn't know any better, so we did it anyway. But it's like there are still some serious engineering miles ahead of us. And also, I just talked about how we're changing our business model to this model where other people run the machines, because we finally think the machines are good enough to essentially let people do that. That model is not proven out yet. So basically, the core tech, the business model around it, it's not like super what you would call a product market fit, which is this moment in a startup's history where you just have this scalable, repeatable way of selling this because the product works the way it just should. It's a no-brainer, and you know the business model you deliver to the market with is fully validated. So Canvas has got some interesting miles ahead of us to travel. Like so it's certainly by no means over.
Best of luck for that.
Thank you.
Great. We have Dean Reed. Dean, I've unmuted you. Dean's a board member of CIDCI.
I'll be on my best behavior.
Okay, thank you. That's the idea.
I love your behavior, Henrik. Yeah, this is an incredible innovation story. A couple of questions that, around how can the industry leverage and help innovators like with your mindset, which you've really laid it out for us very clearly. So, for instance, there are large industry organizations like Construction User Roundtable. There's university programs really focused on the industry, like Center for Sci-Fi at Stanford. There's CII at the University of Texas, and there's USC. There are substantial programs that are very interested in, of course, in what you're doing, but who actually also want to promote and be a part of innovation. So you have these organizations in universities, but within the industry, and AGC comes to mind. And I wondered if you had interactions with them on your journey, or what you would think about what you would ask them to do, to perhaps to change their approach, so that the path could be quicker and more certain. And so we could keep you focused on this industry, for example. And obviously, it has been a great learning experience, but a tough one for you. And not everybody is you and can make it through.
Thank you for that question. And a couple of thoughts. First of all, I would definitely say that I think everywhere where you see innovation just thrive, there is an ecosystem around it. So I really like your question because it sort of broadens out who gets to participate in this change that I think that we're collectively trying to effect in the construction, in the construction industry. If you go to startups really need a couple of things. Frankly, they need customers so that they can learn, and of course, one day maybe even have a business model that's not venture capital. And the second, of course, is they need funding. So if you want sort of to help a startup ecosystem grow, those are a couple of things that they need very directly. Now, what can that look like? Well, on the customer side, that early adopter moment where your minimum viable product is quite minimal, and you might even come out on a construction site and actually kind of fall flat on your face. That is a tough place to be. I think we were uniquely able to do that because we kind of came with momentum from the research space. But if you imagine that we had sort of been the classic startup story of meeting in a garage and then trying to get to this minimum viable product that we could then bring out on construction site, I think I'm not even sure the canvas would have been possible, quite frankly. Maybe it would, but it's hard for me to see. So I would say create incubators, create protected spaces that startups can live in these early stages. I often think of these early idea stages as these kind of very fragile babies. Like it's so easy to say everything that they can't do and how they fall short and so many things about them. But if you're willing to take a look, there's also endless potential here. And if you're willing to see the potential and past all the shortcomings and help that grow, it is super exciting. And I think also in that ecosystem thinking, I mean, one of the things we're benefiting from right now also is on the startup side of things, there are actually now people who have sold companies and are willing to invest into young companies that come in. So my headline back to you is just like anything that you can do to play a positive role in the ecosystem. And frankly, I think this forum and the forum that you have created, that you serve on the board of, is one. Anything that strengthens the ecosystem, in my mind, is a good thing because there are still things about it that are hard. There are still things about it that are probably a little more bruising than frankly they should be. But people, good actors in the ecosystem that want to look at innovation at this early stage and roll up their own sleeves are incredibly valuable. And there is a too long to mention a list of people who fit that description, without whom we would have been utterly lost.
Yes, thank you. So my takeaway is we need more mothers for the innovation ecosystem in construction.
Mothers, nannies, au pairs, anybody who wants to help these babies.
Okay,
modern men who don't mind like taking on the father role.
We got to start working on that. I've just unmuted Stuart Eckbott, who's the chair of CIDCI. Stuart, did you want to say something?
I would. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
So first of all, Henrik, I loved your presentation and really the personal approach. So thank you so much. So my question, actually I have several, but I'm only going to ask one. So did you learn, and all the things that you learned as you were producing and creating this machine and the technology, and did you learn anything about the drywall itself, not the business, but in other words, the materials? Is there an extension of in using this machine that started to teach you more about other materials and other ways to think about materials in the construction industry?
That's a great question. Thank you. I talked about walking backwards into the future. I think one of the ways that we're walking backwards into the future is that we're using existing materials. We just apply them very differently. That's one way of describing what we do. I would say, are keenly aware that this can't be the end of it. Sometimes I like to say, imagine if you took regular architectural paints and then applied them in the automotive industry, where you have this incredible application mechanism through these, like, car painting robots that are incredibly advanced. But imagine if you didn't do anything with the chemicals. Imagine you just sprayed on architectural paint. How different, how much less advanced, how less corrosion resistant cars would be these days. Remember when cars used to break because you literally like put your foot through the bottom of them? Now, that is canvas currently, essentially. We're essentially the equivalent of putting architectural paints on cars right now. We are very, very excited to improve the material. And at the same time, we're also humble in this idea that material science is not our core skill set. We have conversations with folks in the industry about what would a material appropriate for our sort of native to our way of doing things. What would that look like? And I think that could really move us forward. So I think one of the things that is so excited about this, and one of the things that make this journey worth it, I think, is the potential to just make incredible progress as well, right? So even as we kind of sort of show a fancy video with machines and stuff, I really think of this as canvas on first base, because the materials haven't changed. There's so much potential to improve it. There's so much potential to ask yourself deep questions. It's like, is the hanging and the finishing and the painting even a separate process, or is there a way to converge them all into one process? Like, what does framing look like? Like, I think there's a lot to do. And I think one of the things that's really exciting about drywall finishing for us is that it is this kind of first base. It has neighboring issues that you could also take on. So I think material has a huge part in this to play in the future. And I think if we succeed in the way that we hope to, Stuart, you will see us launch some stuff in that space as well that I'm not quite yet ready to talk about. Frankly, it's also not ready in any way, shape, or form, but it's something we're keenly aware of.
Yeah, so thank you. I wasn't asking you for your new ideas. I was just curious. But thank you so much. That's really, really appreciate that. And again, I love your presentation. Very inspiring. Thank you.
Thank you for saying that.
So I think it's very fitting that the last question we'll take today is from Alec Walzer. And I think he might be a student entrepreneur, but I'll let Alex ask his question and let us know from what chair he's sitting in.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for the opportunity to speak to you guys, and also really thanks for the presentation. It's super inspiring, and I could not agree more that actually you have to collaborate in today's environment, especially in construction, using new technologies. So my question goes into the direction, what can we do as educators? I'm based also in AC-related discipline at a university in Europe. So I'm wondering, entrepreneurship is not part of any of our curriculums at most universities, as you know, in the built environment. What can we do, and what can we tell the students? What are your top tips for students to also, undertake a new a new enterprise, a new venture, to become founders, and just to motivate them a little bit? What are your maybe top 3 tips for students that have ideas?
Let me start with sort of the role of academia and then move on to the student to sort of follow your question. I think when academia doesn't connect to industry in a good way, it's a little bit like that Venn diagram I described with automation and the construction industry. It's these like 2 bubbles that don't touch. I think when they do touch, I think interesting things have happened. I think maybe the best example I have firsthand knowledge of is the classic sort of sci-fi at Stanford here, who I think have taken a very industry forward approach and very deeply collaborative. A lot of people in industry come to sci-fi, and I believe the sci-fi go to industry as well. So that's really starting to see those 2 circles of that Venn diagram get pushed closer together. So I would love to have, academia not be sort of the classic sort of ivory tower, but something that wants to be involved in the world and push itself closer. And I think Sci-Fi has actually proven a pretty strong model for that. I think for entrepreneurs, there is, or for students aspiring to be entrepreneurs, there is a little bit of a learning by doing you have to be very cognizant of. I certainly think that there's a big role for education to provide them sort of with a basis of knowledge that they can go into. But I think if that sort of theoretical approach, if you will, went hand in hand with a practical approach that sort of says, well, you got to build a company, you got to do something. Entrepreneurship is just not something you can sort of learn in the abstract, in my opinion. You really have to do it. Sometimes people describe a startup as a roller coaster, where it's like it goes up and down and it moves around, and it's certainly true. It really is that, and it's a bewildering process in many ways. But sometimes I think you also talk to people who stand next to the roller coaster and they look at it and they see it go up and down, and they can give this abstract idea, oh, it goes up and down, all those things. But the difference between being the person looking at the roller coaster and the person riding the roller coaster at the visceral level could just not be more profound. So I would say, as sort of an actor in academia, give them a theoretical understanding, help them learn from others, but also push them towards learning by doing, because that is the only way to do it. That was the top one. I don't even think I have 2 and 3. Sorry about that.
Fantastic. Thanks a lot. Thank you.
That's so great. Henrik, we cannot thank you enough. This was such a fabulous presentation, and we're so appreciative of you sort of revealing the journey, what worked, what didn't work, and what you learned from it. It's rare to have someone as reflective as you, I think, tell us this story. So we're really looking forward to having you back in a couple of years and learning what you hear in the next part of your journey, because it's really amazing. So thank you so very much. We're really looking forward to hearing more about the new challenges you're about to take on.
I'll come back when I have some fresh scar tissue.
That sounds great. Okay, so this will conclude today's CIDCI online salon. We're recording this. It'll be on our CIDCI website as soon as possible. To join us for future webinars, be sure to subscribe to our newsletter. Our next salon is next week. CIDCI will partner with the NorCal chapter of the Association for Medical Facilities Professionals to convene a cross-sectional panel from the Bay Area to reflect on the systemic disparities which have been revealed over the past year and how we can take steps to move forward more equitably. Thanks for joining us, and we'll look forward to hearing more from all of you soon. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.